who were you then and who are you now, and what's been happening in between?
Yeah, I think when we talked last, I was at a point in my life where I was testing culture with lots and lots of small experiments, and that was both personal, so I was doing things like dressing up as a character from Mad Men. I was painting Keyboard Cat and selling it on eBay for a nice $1,000. I was just doing strange experiments just to understand how culture worked, especially a digital culture. And flash forward now to I work inside large organizations to help prepare the conditions for a market that's so much faster, that a future that's so much more uncertain, and really get our hands dirty getting into the team itself and figuring out what the right strategy for culture is, what the right structure of the work and the people are, and then what systems exist inside the company, whether that's back-end technical systems or that's information sharing or decision-making systems. So how do I connect that with a narrative thread? I think what I understood is that culture now behaves in a completely new way. And at first we rode this wave of digital disrupts culture and digital disrupts how brands talk to consumers, to digital disrupts how products are made, to digital disrupts how teams organize and how teams communicate and how the work is done. And we sort of just rode that wave, and I'm not ashamed of riding that digital wave. Even if you track back all the changes that are happening in the modern workplace, they all come back to digital.
Do you see any are you working with any corporations who are doing the kinds of experiment with culture that you did for Mad Men?
It's been difficult. I worked in advertising for a while, so between those two jumps was a stint in advertising, pure advertising, and we definitely helped clients. There was a campaign we did for Pop Secret called Pop Secret Labs, where we ran an experiment every single month, and that was really successful. I think we beat our competitor, which had a 30-time media spend. But it's difficult. I just think that clients are used to buying what they bought before, and I became a little frustrated because everyone was trying to fill the media buy that they bought last year that had nothing to do with what was happening in culture this year. But that's just the structure of their organization. So I felt like I had to leave advertising to fix these companies because they can't be their most creative and they can't get the most creative work out of their partners structured the way that they're structured. And they want to do things differently. They're just not incentivized to do so.
Right. We've seen a kind of shift at the extreme. It may be a shift from a deep strategic contemplation of the future to a kind of improv that says we're just going to respond to whatever happens in the next sort of week or month or year. And Dan's strategy, it's all about just-in-time responsiveness. That's, I think there are lots of things to talk about that, but one of the things is it really sort of opens them up to creativity and experimentation they didn't do before if they can be persuaded that culture is a domain in which to experiment just as much as the marketplace is.
Yeah, and I think there's some macro trends that you can typically bet on, like an empowered consumer, which is becoming more of an empowered employee. These are longer macro trends that you can bet on, and I think the role of strategy with capital S there is still worthwhile, but I think you're right, it is more like improv when it comes to culture. As long as you're aligned with those macro trends, though, you tend to do pretty well. Again, I think the nature of relationships in most companies, whether that's a outsourcing relationship or the relationship they have with their in-house services, just makes that harder and harder. And for every example you see of Oreo in the world, which was when I was in advertising, that was the example you couldn't run away from. You think about that, I think when you look back at it, that took 6 different partner agencies to pull off.
Wow.
That was exceedingly expensive versus what artists and people who just play in culture tend to do, where it's just a lot of cheap, safe-to-fail experiments. Like Oreo was not safe to fail, even though it's lauded as this great experimental achievement.
We've talked about making the corporation 2 corporations. Could you?
Yeah, there's an underlying conflict that we've discussed about who's optimizing the business, who owns the business model that's been working, and who needs to own the business model of the future, or the ways of the future. And I think it's just too much cognitive load to ask one person to do both. And I think what you ultimately have is sort of that safe middle ground that everyone falls into, where they're like, I'll try to take a tiny risk, but that doesn't, on a large scale, doesn't play out. I think we look at a barbell strategy of having folks and systems and structures that are just focused on let's optimize the business for what it is, let's like cut some inefficiencies, and let's just make sure that we're a streamlined, simple organization. And on the other side, let's build an innovation pipeline. Let's have the right sort of people who are good at exposing opportunities, not necessarily capitalizing on them. I do feel like those are two completely different skills. And then I think the mistake that most companies make, though, that idea has been around for a long time, but the mistake most people run into is, one, they either separate that innovation core way too far away, like every company that has a Silicon Valley lab, that they never actually learn. It's like Xerox PARC is the example there of an organization that can invent the future, but you can't commercialize it, so what's the point of it? And then they also think that the goal is to move those people back into the company, when the goal of having that arm is actually to inflict that mindset on everyone else. And we look at rotating people through an innovation core so that you can actually get that sort of osmosis process happening. And I think actually the number one thing that can kill an innovation team is their own success, because once a CEO sees one success over there, they try to pull it all the way back into the company. A good example of that is Amazon's lab, A126, I think it's called, where they created the Kindle, and it was this amazing device, and it was like, leaps ahead in technology. And then it became Jeff Bezos' pet team, and they created the Kindle, or the Fire Phone, which was just his pet project, which had all of that technology that no one wanted, 6 cameras, all this crazy stuff. And that was a perfect example of a success story becoming their own demise.
That's very interesting. So the work you're doing now, Nobel, tell me, describe that in general terms, but also if you would talk about it in terms of this double culture.
Yeah, I mean, we help fundamentally people change the way they work, and we empower human agency inside companies. What I think is missing inside most large companies is we've taken human choice away. And so what we work to do is we're actually not the experts, we're just facilitators and coaches of new ways of working. We have a huge repository of how Google does blank or how Yahoo does something that we bring into companies, but it's up to the teams we work with to identify and articulate their own problems and then solve for those problems. And we guide them throughout the process, and we create ways of working pilots. So it could be something completely small, like let's try a different kind of status meeting, to let's have a central budgeting function inside the entire marketing department, but we try to find safe to fail increments that we can try it. And then we also identify, while we're doing that work, the cult of the curious, that's what I call them, sort of the people inside the company who, for whatever reason, represent the future of that company. We pull them out and we train them in our ways of working so they can become coaches inside the company. And then that's about 3 to 5 hours a week for them, but it's a huge amount of training that they get. And that's what we do. And then we sort of watch it spread across the company, and we move to different teams and sort of turn on the lights in different departments. And sometimes that means we build innovation pipelines. For a client in Irvine, California, we built a whole innovation pipeline and innovation team because they were ready for it. Some clients are, some clients aren't.
So, tell me what you see happening in the near future and the far future, for you personally and for you professionally.
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, so our company is always 3 things, I say. It's consulting services, which I hope to always stay small and the absolute best people we can find, but that's a small group of people on the planet who can do this work. Not because we're geniuses, but because it's a highly specialized field, and you have to have the right emotional characteristics to not be an expert, but to actually be a coach. The second thing that we are educators, so we're launching an online learning platform for ways of working, where you can just take a quick 10-minute class on how to run a better meeting, and you can take that back to your teams, and you don't have to pay for the full consulting services. And then the last thing is we have to be a software business. So I think for us, there's an opportunity for a system of record inside organizations that own both how the organization works and what they're working on. Right now, everyone pays attention to what you're working on, so there's project management systems, but no one really pays attention to how teams operate. And I think what I see in the future, and I might be crazy, is a marketplace for ways of working inside every large company, where you can say, we follow Agile, or we follow this version of Lean, and I'm going to go get trained by someone else internally who does this, and I can see how they work, and I can go give feedback on the process and sort of copy and paste ways of working across the company is what I'd see. So what I hope for, what I'm trying to do, and this is probably where I'm completely crazy, is I'm trying to exponentially scale services business. So I'm trying to find a model in which we can scale our impact. So our purpose in the world is to change how every organization works and give choice back to the employees. So to do that, though, we have to find an exponentially scalable model. So I think that is consultants armed with software and on-demand learning service. That's what we're betting on.
Fantastic.
I think your question about what I think looms in the future, I'm going to go against the grain a little bit just because I pay a lot of attention to employment data, and what we're seeing is actually, we all talk about startups, we talk about San Francisco like it's the center of the world now, but actually more employees are headed to larger, older companies. You're actually seeing the lowest rates of entrepreneurialism in the US ever, I think, since we started measuring it.
Wow.
So it actually goes against the cultural noise. So what I worry is that we're headed sort of to organizations that are too big to fail, and their own bureaucracy will slow them, but that we can't allow them to fail. So even the GEs of the world, or the Coca-Colas, where we have huge number of people employed, will face an enormous amount of headwind as they try to deal with emerging markets. We're starting to see so much competition coming not just from the US anymore, and I worry about the role of people inside those companies. I think management has always either seen people as errant children to be controlled, and now we're moving into an era where management thinks of people as robots waiting for instructions. I feel like there's a third way that someone has to pioneer, and we have to force that option, which is human beings are actually incredibly creative and can be incredibly accountable creatures inside your company, but we don't see them that way. But the Ubers of the world are making us think that everyone's an on-demand worker. You're starting to hear things like the self-driving organization, just crazy ideas that I worry are going to take the humanity out of work. And when it comes to culture, then, if you have like an organization that is devoid of humanity, how can they operate in culture? Like, what does culture start to look like when organizations look like that? To me, it looks more like the 50s.
Right.
Like, it looks like more like a monoculture. It looks more homogenized. It looks safer.
I wonder if this is sort of a corny comparison, but it's maybe apt. And that's the NFL quarterback who takes the play from the sideline, but then is empowered in those 15 seconds in which he looks across the line of scrimmage at a defense that's reconfiguring itself, and he changes the play, and will sometimes change the play a third time before the ball is hiked. Right?
Yeah.
That just-in-time stuff is fantastically interesting. And what it does it means the game becomes more fluid in a weird kind of way. Everybody has to be smarter. Everyone's powers of pattern recognition in some sense, it's maybe true, the world's so liquid now that unless you tap the powers of creativity and cognitive power, pattern recognition, cognition of the people in place, you just can't adapt. Maybe some structural innovations of the kind we've been talking about, having two corporations. But even when you do that, both parties, even the incumbent party, the party at the center, is probably going to have to change plays as they're being executed.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. Does that sound plausible?
Yeah, I think your definition of culture or the world being liquid is dead on. We tend to think, so we've been studying high-performing teams for the last 5 or 6 years. We tend to think that they have 4 things in common. One, they're customer obsessed, so they look for patterns in customers. That doesn't mean they do everything a customer asks for, but they look for patterns. What's happening in culture, what's happening for customers. And they're not afraid to leave the building and actually go ask people. They don't just rely on quant. The second thing is they tend to be aligned. They have the same vision, they have the same shared reality, shared future. They talk a lot about what they share in common.
They're aligned with one another?
Yes. Yeah. And then the third thing is they're autonomous, to the point of which I think you hear that word and it sounds like they're given free rein, but they're not. I think what we've noticed is the most successful teams have the freedom to have an idea and to test it. That doesn't necessarily mean they commercialize it all the way, but they're able to test it in a market of some kind.
Right.
Whether that's like, for some beauty brands, it's like, let's just create a new fake brand and see if we can go sell this thing before we roll it back up into Chanel, for example.
Right.
But they have some level of autonomy, like you said, about the quarterback.
Right.
They're able at that last second to make snap decisions because they have local information.
Right.
And then the last thing is they're simple. So they have simple rules that govern them, because a quarterback can't do that if he's going back up a chain and it's 35 policies to get approval. He has to have some simple rules in place that he can make those decisions. So those 4 things: customer obsessed, aligned, autonomous, and simple. Those are the things we tend to measure for, and we try to optimize for when we work with teams.
So people, well, perfect. This is so good. Great. Okay, thank you so much. This is really great. Thank